The notice was stuck to my front door with the kind of aggressive tape that leaves residue, which told me everything I needed to know about the person who put it there. I was eating cereal, the kind with the marshmallows, because I'm a grown adult who makes his own choices, standing at the kitchen counter in my socks when I saw the fluorescent orange paper flapping against the glass. It was 7:15 in the morning. I had worked until midnight the night before, finishing a structural load analysis for a bridge retrofit project. My coffee was still brewing. I was not prepared for what the universe had decided to serve alongside my lucky charms. I opened the door, peeled the notice off, and read it. Violation notice, HOA covenant enforcement, property, 14 Sycamore Glen Drive, resident, Logan Mercer, violation section 4.7, B, commercial or industrial vehicle parking prohibition. Vehicle description, black Ford, 250. Super Duty license plate, redacted. You are hereby directed to remove said vehicle from visible street or driveway parking within 72 hours or face fines of $150/day. I looked at my truck. My truck looked back at me. It had 140,000 miles on it, a dent above the rear wheel well from a job site in 2019, and a Support Our Troops magnet on the tailgate that had partially faded to a suggestion. It was, in the technical legal sense of the term, a personal vehicle registered to one Logan Mercer of 14 Sycamore Glen Drive. It was not a dump truck. It was not a backhoe. It was not a cement mixer. It was a pickup truck. The same as roughly 40% of vehicles in the continental United States, a fact I knew because I'd once spent 3 hours on a Friday night reading transportation statistics, which is apparently something I do. I went inside, poured my coffee, and read Section 4.7b of the Sycamore Glen HOA Covenants. Then I read it again. Then I stared at the wall for a while. Brenda Kowalski had been HOA president for 6 years, which in suburban governance terms is roughly equivalent to a third-world dictator who's survived 4 coup attempts. She was 53 years old, and carried herself like someone who had once been told she had a gift for leadership and had never recovered from the compliment. I met her formally about 11 minutes after reading the notice, because apparently she had been watching from the street. She was standing at the edge of my driveway when I came back outside, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, wearing a floral blouse that had been ironed with the kind of precision usually reserved for surgical linens. Her hair was set in a style I could only describe as aggressively helmet-shaped, brown with highlights the color of a manila envelope, and she wore a lanyard, an actual lanyard, bearing her HOA president badge, as though someone might challenge her credentials. In her left hand, at all times, she carried a retractable metal measuring tape, which she had a habit of extending and snapping shut when she was making a point, like a tiny chrome punctuation mark. "Mr. Mercer," she said with a smile that had been installed rather than grown, "I trust you received my notice." Snap. "I did," I said. "I have a few questions about it. The covenant language is quite clear." Snap. Section 4.7b prohibits vehicles of a commercial or industrial classification from being parked in visible areas of residential properties. Your F-250 Super Duty is classified by the manufacturer as a heavy-duty work truck and by the IRS as a commercial vehicle for depreciation purposes. "It's registered as a personal vehicle with the DMV," I said. "I use it to drive to work and to Home Depot." "The covenant doesn't concern itself with your shopping habits, Mr. Mercer." Snap. "It concerns itself with the aesthetic integrity of this community." I looked down the street. Gary Phelps had a base boat on a trailer in his side yard that was roughly the size of a small aircraft carrier. The Delacroix family had an RV parked in their driveway with a mural of the Grand Canyon airbrushed on the side. Neither of these had received, as far as I knew, fluorescent orange notices. "What about Gary's boat?" I asked. Brenda's smile tightened by approximately 1 millimeter. Mr. Phelps keeps his recreational vessel in compliance with Section 4.7(c), which provides an exception for non-motorized watercraft stored on the side yard with screening. She paused. Barely in compliance, I'll note. That's a separate matter. My truck has never once been used for commercial purposes while parked in my own driveway, I said. I think there's a reasonable argument that 72 hours, Mr. Mercer. Snap. Have a lovely morning. She turned and walked back down my driveway with the measured gait of someone who had just handed down a sentence. I stood there holding my coffee mug, watching her go. The cereal was soggy by the time I got back inside. I tried the reasonable approach because I am, at baseline, a reasonable person. I sent a certified letter to the HOA board formally disputing the classification under Virginia DMV definitions, which are the controlling authority in this state, not IRS depreciation schedules that Brenda had apparently been reading in her spare time for fun. I included 3 attachments: the vehicle registration, the relevant DMV classification code, and a 2-paragraph legal analysis that I wrote myself, because I spent 4 years working adjacent to transportation attorneys on infrastructure contracts and had absorbed a non-trivial amount of property and administrative law through pure professional osmosis. The board met on a Tuesday. I attended. Brenda ran the meeting from a folding table at the front of the Sycamore Glen clubhouse with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting her whole life for this room. She wore the lanyard. She had a gavel, which was not strictly necessary for a 12-person HOA meeting in a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. But she used it with conviction. My dispute was agenda item 4, sandwiched between a discussion about mailbox post-paint colors and a complaint about someone's wind chimes. I presented my argument. It was calm, accurate, and correct. The board voted 7-2 against me. I asked Brenda afterward, by the folding table while she was capping her highlighters, whether she could explain the legal basis for the vote given the DMV classification issue I'd raised. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has confused authority with expertise for so long the distinction has become genuinely invisible to them. The board has wide discretion in interpreting covenant language, she said. That's in Section 12.3. Section 12.3 governs landscaping disputes, I said. She recapped her highlighter. Have a lovely evening, Mr. Mercer. I drove home, in my truck, for the last time in its driveway, and I sat in the cab for a few minutes looking at my house. Then I went inside, opened a beer at 9:40 p.m. We noted that the circumstances more than justified it, and opened my laptop. I should explain what I do for a living, because it's relevant. I'm a structural and civil engineer, licensed in Virginia, with a secondary background in zoning and land use compliance from 15 years of fighting municipalities over project permits. I understand load-bearing specifications, I understand setback regulations, and I understand, perhaps most usefully, the difference between what a rule says and what it actually covers. The Sycamore Glen HOA covenants were 22 pages long. I had read them once, quickly, when I bought the house. Now I read them the way I read a structural report on a building someone is telling me is sound, slowly, with a yellow highlighter, and the specific intention of finding where the load paths don't connect. I found it on page 11. Section 4.7(b), the one Brenda had weaponized, prohibited parking of commercial or industrial vehicles in visible areas. Her argument, such as it was, rested on the truck's classification for IRS purposes. Fine. But Section 4.7 in its entirety was titled Restrictions on Commercial and Industrial Vehicles. Scroll back to Section 1, the Definitions section. Vehicle, for purposes of Section 4, shall be defined as any self-propelled conveyance designed for use on public roadways and licensed for operation thereon by state or federal transportation authorities. A tank, a decommissioned military tank, is not licensed for operation on public roadways. It is not a vehicle under Section 4 of the Sycamore Glen HOA covenants. It is not a vehicle under any section because nobody in 1987 When these covenants were written by a real estate attorney who was almost certainly thinking about RVs and work vans, anticipated that this clause would need to cover armored fighting vehicles. I sat back in my chair. I drank some of the beer. I stared at the ceiling for a moment, the way you do when you've just seen something that cannot be unseen. Then I opened a new browser tab and searched. Decommissioned? Military surplus vehicles for sale, civilian. The Army had thoughts on this, as it turned out. The U.S. government periodically sells surplus military equipment through a program called the Defense Reutilization and Marketing Service. And while the process for fully tracked armored vehicles is more complicated than buying a surplus Jeep, it is, and this is the critical point, not impossible. Especially when the vehicle in question is an M60 Patton tank that had been decommissioned in the early 90s, had its main gun rendered permanently inoperable per federal demilitarization standards, and was currently sitting on a lot in Fredericksburg, Virginia, listed for sale to a private buyer at a price that I will describe only as less than my truck. I called the number on the listing at 8 in the morning, which felt, under the circumstances, like sleeping in. The man who answered was named Dale. "You're serious," Dale said, after I explained what I needed and, more importantly, why. "As a load-bearing calculation," I said. There was a pause. "Son," Dale said, "I have been selling surplus military equipment for 19 years, and I have never once rooted for a customer this hard. Let me tell you about transport logistics." Dale became, in this story, what I can only describe as my ally, my logistical co-conspirator, and the single most enthusiastic participant in an operation he had nothing to gain from except, in his words, the privilege of watching. He was 61 years old, had forearms like bridge cables, wore the same Carhartt jacket every time I saw him regardless of temperature, and had a silver tooth on the upper left side that caught the light when he grinned, which he did frequently and without apology. His first line to me, when we met in person at the lot in Fredericksburg to inspect the tank, was, "She's got some cosmetic rust on the left tread assembly, but structurally she's mean as a snake and twice as reliable." He said this the way a man compliments a horse he respects. The M60, Patton, was roughly the size of a modest guest bedroom. It weighed 54 tons. It was painted in a faded olive drab that had, in certain patches, developed a color I could only describe as the dignified green of a government institution in mild decline. The gun barrel had been cut and filled with concrete per demilitarization requirements, which gave it a slightly blunt, earnest expression, like a retired boxer who'd had his hands wrapped one final time purely out of habit. It was, I decided immediately, perfect. "Virginia law," I told Dale while we walked around it, "doesn't require non-highway vehicles to be registered. You just can't drive them on public roads." "You're going to park it on your lawn," Dale said. "In my driveway," I said. "Technically on my private property. So, which is my legal right as a homeowner." Dale looked at the tank. The tank, insofar as a 54-ton armored vehicle can look back at anything, seemed to be in agreement. "What exactly," Dale said slowly, "did this woman do to you?" "She cited my truck." He nodded. "I'll throw in transport for cost," he said. "I want to be there when you unveil it. Here is what I need to tell you about the 2 weeks between my HOA board meeting and the arrival of the tank, because it matters for the record." Brenda Kowalski did not sit quietly in her house waiting to see how things unfolded. Brenda Kowalski escalated. First, she filed a secondary violation notice citing my lawn edging as being inconsistent with community standards, which, when I measured it, was within a 1/4 inch of the covenant specification. She had measured it too. I could see the small divots in the soil where she'd placed her tape measure, like a forensic investigator at a crime scene involving grass. Then she organized a community beautification walk that happened to route directly past my house, during which I observed her pointing at my property and shaking her head at a small group of neighbors who had the expressions of people deeply uncertain how they had ended up here on a Saturday morning. Then, and this was the one that got quiet in me, she knocked on my door on a Wednesday evening while I was eating a sandwich, and informed me, pleasantly, that she had raised the issue with 2 of my neighbors about whether my presence in the community was Consistent with the values of Sycamore Glen. I ate the rest of my sandwich after she left. It was turkey. Tucker, it was fine, but I'd heard something in her voice when she said values of Sycamore Glen, a specific warmth, a satisfaction that had nothing to do with truck parking or lawn edging. It had to do with the truck itself, the work gear in the bed, the job site sticker on the back window, the general suggestion, radiating off my whole property, that a person who worked with his hands lived here. She didn't want a tidier neighborhood. She wanted a tidier class of neighbor. I didn't say anything. I just got a little quieter, internally, in the way that precedes very deliberate action. The tank arrived on a Thursday. Dale had arranged transport via a flatbed heavy-haul rig driven by a man named Vic, who had the energy of someone who had seen everything twice and remained, against all odds, delighted by it. The rig was long enough that it had to take the corner onto Sycamore Glen Drive at roughly 2 miles per hour, which gave the neighborhood approximately 4 full minutes to notice it was happening. They noticed. By the time the flatbed had positioned itself in front of my house, there were 7 people on the sidewalk. I was standing in my driveway with a cup of coffee. Dale was standing next to me with his silver tooth catching the morning light. He had brought a thermos and a folding chair, which he set up on my lawn with the calm preparation of a man attending an outdoor sporting event. Vic operated the hydraulics with the focused expression of a surgeon. The M60 Patton descended from the flatbed in stages, its 54 tons settling onto my driveway with a finality that I felt in my back teeth. The concrete, which I had checked and found to be rated for the load because I am a structural engineer, and this is the kind of thing I check, absorbed it without complaint. The tank sat in my driveway. It was enormous. It was functional. It had a small American flag I had purchased and affixed to the antenna mount, which was, I felt, a reasonable touch. "Beautiful," Dale said from his lawn chair. One of my neighbors, a retired electrician named Frank who lived 4 houses down, had appeared with his own lawn chair and a thermos of what I strongly suspected was not coffee. He positioned himself at a comfortable viewing angle with the quiet efficiency of a man who has identified the day's main event and intends to miss none of it. I walked to the end of my driveway, looked at the tank, looked at the neighborhood, and went inside to make more coffee. Tortund. Brenda arrived 47 minutes later. I know it was 47 minutes because I was watching from the kitchen window with the specific patience of a man who has calculated every load and is waiting to see if the structure holds. She came down the sidewalk at her standard pace, clipboard pressed to her chest, lanyard bouncing. But something was different. The rhythm of the measuring tape, usually a crisp, decisive snap, had increased in frequency, which I had come to understand was an indicator of elevated internal weather. She was wearing a cream blazer over a floral blouse, and her helmet hair was immaculate, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. She stopped at the end of my driveway. She looked at the tank. The tank was not concerned. She looked at it for a long time. Long enough that Frank, from his lawn chair, lifted his thermos in a small, solemn toast to no one in particular. Then she walked up my driveway, and I opened the front door before she could knock, because I had been standing 4 feet from it. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice had the tightly controlled quality of a pressure vessel that has been informed it is fine, everything is fine, there is no pressure. "What is that?" "An M60 Patton tank," I said. "Decommissioned, manufactured 1962, retired from service 1993. She's a classic." "Snap. You cannot park that on your property." "I looked into it," I said. "I really did. Under Section 4.7 of the Sycamore Glen Covenants, restrictions apply to vehicles as defined in Section 1.3. Self-propelled conveyances licensed for operation on public roadways. The M60 is not licensed for roadway use. It's not a vehicle under the covenant's own definition. It's more in the nature of a lawn ornament." Brenda looked at me. "A lawn ornament." "A large one," I agreed. Snap, snap, snap. I'll be taking this to the board." "That's your right," I said. You might also want to look at Section 7.4, which covers exterior decorative installations. You'll find that non-motorized static objects on private property require board approval only if they exceed, I tilted my head as if trying to remember, 48 inches in height without prior approval. The tank is about 110 inches, so you'll want to schedule that vote. She stared at me. But I should mention, I added, that Section 7.4d specifies that decorative installations with historical or commemorative significance are exempt from the height restriction, provided the homeowner submits documentation to the board. I reached into my back pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. I've prepared the documentation. It covers the tank's service history, its role in Cold War deterrence operations, and its current status as a privately owned piece of American military heritage. I held it out. She did not take it. "Have a lovely morning, Brenda," I said. The board meeting was the following Tuesday. I arrived early and sat in the front row, which I had never done before. Dale came with me because he said he wasn't going to miss the second act, and sat beside me wearing his Carhartt jacket with the sleeves pushed up, silver tooth glinting under the fluorescent lights. He had brought 2 cans of iced tea from a gas station, one of which he handed to me without comment. The can was very cold. I appreciated it. The room was more full than usual. Word had apparently gotten around because I counted 19 people in a room that typically held 8. Frank, the retired electrician, was in the back row. He had the same thermos. Brenda called the meeting to order with her gavel, twice, which was one more time than necessary. She was in the cream blazer again. The lanyard was present. The measuring tape had not been left at home. "Agenda item 1, she said, is an emergency session to address an unauthorized structure installed at 14 Sycamore Glen Drive." She had done her homework. I'll give her that. She had found a county ordinance, not a covenant, an actual county ordinance, regarding nuisance installations on residential property. And she presented it with the contained excitement of someone laying down what they believe to be a trump card. I let her finish. "That ordinance," I said from the front row, "applies to installations that create a public safety hazard, as defined by the county code. The definition requires either a structural risk to neighboring properties or an environmental contamination concern. The tank is a solid steel structure on a reinforced concrete driveway. I'm a licensed structural engineer. I've run the load calculations. I have them here." I tapped the folder on my knee. I also checked with the county directly. A decommissioned, demilitarized armored vehicle on private property does not meet the nuisance threshold. I have that in writing, from the county, dated last Friday. I produced the letter. The room had gone very quiet. Brenda took the letter. She read it. She set it down. "Furthermore," I said, "I've filed the Section 7.4d commemorative exemption documentation with the board secretary, so the height restriction doesn't apply. And since the tank isn't a vehicle under the covenant's own definition, Section 4.7 doesn't apply." I paused. "I don't think there's a covenant mechanism that covers this, Brenda." Someone in the back of the room coughed. It might have been a laugh. "The board," Brenda said very carefully, "will need time to consult with legal counsel." "That's absolutely fair," I said. "I'll leave my contact information. I'm easy to reach. I'm usually home. You can see my driveway from the street." Dale took a slow sip of his iced tea. Here is where I need to tell you about what Dale did, because it was not part of any plan I made. And I want that on the record. During the 2-day period between the board meeting and Brenda's next move, Dale, who had remained in the neighborhood, staying with his cousin 3 blocks over because he said he had a feeling this wasn't done, took it upon himself to perform some additional work on the tank. I did not ask him to do this. I did not know he was doing this until I came outside on a Thursday morning with my cereal to find that the M60 Patton was now flying, from its antenna mount, a full-sized American flag, the proper ceremonial size, not the small one I'd put up, and had been partially hand-painted on the hull facing the street, with the words Sycamore Glen Historical Preservation Society, STs, 2025, in clean stenciled letters, in a color Dale had described as patriotic beige. There was also Abon on the side of the tank facing Brenda's house, 3 doors down, which had a clear sightline from her living room window, a small, tasteful placard that Dale had fabricated and bolted to the hull, reading M60 Patton. In honor of the men and women who served. This vehicle protected American freedoms, including, but not limited to, the right to park on your own property. I stood in my driveway in my socks, holding my cereal bowl, reading the placard. "Dale," I said to the empty driveway. I called him. "Dale." "Morning," he said. "The placard." "Educational," he said. "Historical context." "Dale." "The lettering took me 3 hours," he said with quiet dignity. "You're welcome." From down the street, I heard what I can only describe as the sound of a screen door opening and closing very fast, which is the sound a screen door makes when the person using it is not thinking about the door at all. Brenda arrived at my property at 8:47 a.m., and what happened next is the part I have been building toward, and I will not summarize it. She came down the sidewalk at a pace that had abandoned its usual measured quality entirely. The clipboard was present, but not pressed to her chest. It was down at her side, swinging slightly with each step, which in Brenda's personal semaphore system was the equivalent of someone else pulling a fire alarm. The measuring tape was in her other hand, and it was doing something I had not seen before, which was extending and retracting in a continuous rapid cycle, snap, 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 like a nervous tick that had achieved sentience. She had not done her hair. This, more than anything, told me something had broken loose. Frank the electrician was already in his lawn chair. I had not seen him set it up. He had either been there since dawn or had developed an instinct for these things. He was eating a granola bar, and he did not look up when Brenda passed him, but his jaw stopped moving for a moment, and then resumed. "This," Brenda said, stopping at the end of my driveway and pointing at the placard with her measuring tape, fully extended, "is harassment." "It's a commemorative placard," I said from my porch. "It's part of the Section 7.4D documentation package." "You painted words on a tank that reference parking rights." The measuring tape snapped shut. "That is a direct personal attack. The second sentence refers to all American freedoms broadly," I said. "Parking is listed as an example. The comma and including but not limited to language creates a non-exhaustive list." Brenda made a sound that was not a word. She walked up the driveway. She stopped directly in front of the tank. She was looking up at it. It was 10 feet tall and she was 5'4", with an expression that was moving through a recognizable sequence of stages, like a weather system. There was fury, then something that looked briefly like helplessness, and then, as though she had found a gear she didn't know she had, she hauled the clipboard up and began writing on it. "I'm issuing a formal violation notice," she said, writing. She paused, "for visual nuisance. Section 9.2. Section 9.2 defines visual nuisance as materials that are offensive, obscene, or discriminatory," I said. "A commemorative military vehicle with a respectful historical placard is none of those things." "It is an eyesore," she said, voice rising. "Aesthetics aren't covered by Section 9.2. I am the president of this homeowners association, and I am telling you." "You're the president of a volunteer neighborhood committee," I said. "And I'm a licensed engineer who has read the covenants 12 times. Those are 2 different things." Brenda's pen stopped moving. She looked up from the clipboard. Something was happening in her face that she was not in control of. The careful social arrangement of her features, maintained at considerable ongoing effort, was coming apart in sections. Her mouth was tight, and her nostrils had done something emphatic, and her eyes, when they met mine, had lost the pleasant authority glaze and showed something rawer underneath. "Do you know," she said very quietly, which was somehow worse than loud, "what this neighborhood was like before people like you started moving in?" The measuring tape snapped. I looked at her for a moment. I didn't say anything. She seemed to hear herself, about 2 seconds after the words had left her mouth, and the color that came into her face had nothing to do with anger. She looked down at the clipboard. "I'll be consulting legal counsel," she said, and her voice had lost its temperature. She turned and walked back down my driveway, not at her usual measured pace. Faster. I watched her go. Behind me, Dale's voice came from somewhere near the garage, where he had been, apparently, the entire time. "There it is," he said quietly. I didn't turn around. "Yeah," I said. "There it was." I went inside. I stood at the kitchen counter and ate the rest of my cereal, which was cold, and stared at the window, and was very still for a while. The legal opinion that Brenda's counsel produced, at the HOA's expense, which is to say the neighborhood's expense, which is to say partly my expense, which I noted with a specific kind of amusement, arrived in the form of a letter to the board 9 days later. I received a copy because I had formally requested one under the covenant's transparency provisions, which exist in Section 14 and which I suspect no one had ever actually invoked before. The letter was 4 pages long, and its conclusion, stripped of the billable hour language surrounding it, was this: the covenants, as written, did not prohibit the installation of decommissioned non-highway military vehicles on private property, and pursuing enforcement action would expose the HOA to a credible counterclaim for selective and arbitrary enforcement, given documented evidence, which I had submitted, of the board's inconsistent application of Section 4.7 to other vehicles and structures in the neighborhood. Gary's boat was specifically mentioned, which I had not expected but deeply appreciated. The board, according to the minutes that I also formally requested, voted 5-4 not to pursue further action, with Brenda casting one of the 4 opposing votes, and then, according to 2 witnesses, snapping her measuring tape so hard the mechanism jammed, and the tape refused to retract. She stood there at the front of the clubhouse meeting room for a moment, pulling at the tape with both hands while it drooped limply from the casing, and the room was very quiet. And then board member Teresa Huang leaned over and whispered something to the person next to her, and the 2 of them looked at the floor in the way people look at the floor, when they are not looking at each other. But that was not the meltdown. The meltdown happened on Saturday. I need you to understand the context of Saturday. I had applied, properly with documentation, under the appropriate county permit process, to hold a small neighborhood gathering on my property. A historical vehicle appreciation event, as the permit described it. Technically, a cookout. Dale brought a portable grill. I invited Frank and his wife, my neighbor on the other side, whose name is Paul, and who had told me privately that he thought the whole situation was the funniest thing that has happened on this street since Gary reversed his boat trailer into the Mitchell's mailbox, and about 6 other neighbors who had expressed in the preceding 2 weeks what I would characterize as solidarity through proximity. That is, they kept finding reasons to walk past my driveway. Dale grilled. I provided the beer and the lawn chairs. Someone brought potato salad. The tank sat in the driveway with its flag and its placard, dignified and enormous, and we sat around it in the afternoon sun like it was a very unusual garden feature, which, legally, it was. Brenda arrived at 1:43 p.m. She had not been invited. This was, of course, her right. She was walking on a public sidewalk, but the energy with which she arrived communicated that she had dressed for a confrontation rather than a Saturday. She was in the cream blazer, the lanyard, the measuring tape, which she had apparently had repaired or replaced since the meeting, was at her side. And she stopped at the edge of the property line, which she knew to the inch because she was that kind of person, and looked at the gathering with the expression of someone watching their personal vision of neighborhood order being disassembled and repurposed as lawn furniture. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "do you have a permit for this assembly?" "I do," I said. I went inside and got it and walked it to the property line and held it out. She took it, she read it. She read it a second time. She handed it back. "The grill," she said. "Permit. Residential outdoor cooking does not require a permit in this county," I said. I checked. "The flag on the vehicle, is that a regulation?" 3x5 cotton flag on a private non-highway vehicle on private property, I said. No federal or local regulation governs that. She looked at the gathering. Frank raised his thermos at her in a small, acknowledging gesture. Dale, at the grill, gave her a nod that contained absolutely no warmth, and an amount of amusement he did not bother to conceal. "This whole thing," Brenda said, and her voice was doing something it hadn't done before, a kind of fray at the edges, the sound of a signal losing its tower, "is a mockery." "It's a cookout," I said. "You're welcome to join us. Dale makes good brisket." "I don't want brisket," she said. And then Dale, without looking up from the grill, said, "You sure? Because I'll tell you, Brenda, a woman who goes to this much trouble over where a man parks his truck probably needs to eat something and sit down." There was a silence. Paul, to my left, made a sound into his beer that was technically a cough. Brenda looked at Dale. Dale looked at the grill. The grill was not going to help her. "I," she said, "am the president of this homeowners." "I know what you are," Dale said, turning a piece of brisket. "Everybody here knows what you are." He looked up then, and the silver tooth caught the light, and his expression was not hostile, but it was not friendly, and it was very, very calm. "Question is whether you know what you're doing." Another silence. Longer this time. What happened to Brenda Kowalski in the next 30 seconds was something I have tried to describe to people since, and have not been able to do justice. It was like watching a very complicated mechanical system encounter a load it was not designed for. Every organized, composed, armor-plated system she had built to present herself to this neighborhood, the blazer, the lanyard, the measured speech, the gavel, the measuring tape, seemed to stop functioning simultaneously, and what was under it was neither graceful nor planned. She took one step onto my property, onto the grass, past the property line she had not crossed in 6 years, and pointed at the tank, and said loud enough for the entire gathering to hear, "That thing is not art. It is not history. It is not a lawn ornament. It is a declaration of war, and everyone here knows it, and you all think this is funny because you don't understand what I have done for this neighborhood, what I have sacrificed for this neighborhood. While people like him," she gestured at me without looking at me, "move in with their trucks, and their attitude, and their tank." The measuring tape had come out and was retracting and extending without apparent pattern, snap, 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 a purely involuntary motion now, the body doing something the mind had stopped supervising. "Brenda," said Teresa Huang, who had been standing 3 houses down walking her dog, and had stopped entirely, the dog sitting patiently beside her. "Maybe—" "Don't," said Brenda, wheeling toward Teresa with the measuring tape extended fully, which caused Teresa to take a short step back and her dog to stand up. "Don't maybe me, Teresa. You voted against me in there. I saw you. I've been doing this for 6 years and none of you—" She stopped. She heard herself. The measuring tape hung in the air between her and Teresa, fully extended, chrome in the afternoon sun. Every person at my cookout had gone entirely still. Frank had his thermos raised halfway to his mouth and had not completed the motion. Paul had his beer at his side. Dale was at the grill with the tongs in his hand, not using them. The brisket was probably fine. Teresa's dog sat down again. Brenda lowered the measuring tape. She looked at it in her hand as though it was something she hadn't consciously picked up. She looked at the gathering. She looked at the tank. The tank's flag moved slightly in the afternoon breeze, which was, given the moment, almost too much. She said. She stopped. She turned. She walked back to the sidewalk. She walked down the street. Not at her usual pace, not at the faster pace from before. Slowly and very straight, which is what people do when they are focused on not falling apart until they are somewhere private. Teresa watched her go. Then she looked at her dog. Then she looked at me. I didn't say anything. "Can we have brisket?" Teresa said. "Absolutely," said Dale. The letter arrived from the HOA board 12 days later. It was brief. Brenda's name was not on it as a signatory. That duty had been taken up by the vice president, a quiet man named Howard, who had, in my experience, never done anything except nod slowly and refill the coffee at board meetings. The letter informed me that the board had conducted a review of enforcement actions taken under Section 4.7 over the preceding 6 years, and had determined that the provision had been applied inconsistently and would be paused pending a covenant revision process open to all residents. Gary Phelps called me that evening to tell me his boat was still in the side yard, and to say thank you, which was unnecessary but which I appreciated. I didn't do anything with the tank right away. It sat in the driveway through September, flag moving in the morning air, placard legible from the street. A few people slowed down when they drove past. A few people waved. At some point in early October, I moved my truck back into the driveway beside the tank. The truck looked, in comparison, very small, but it looked exactly right, parked in my own driveway, on my own property, on a street where a man named Frank sat in a lawn chair and watched the neighborhood run its quiet daily operations. I was on the porch one evening when I saw Brenda's light on across the way. The cream blazer was on the coat rack, visible through her front window. The lanyard was on a hook beside it. I drank my coffee. I noticed, going through the revised covenant draft that had been distributed to residents, that Section 4.7b had been substantially narrowed, but Section 4.7, a new addition had been added, covering historical and commemorative non-highway vehicles. It was very specific language. Someone had written it carefully. I made a note to attend the next board meeting. The tank is still in the driveway. I had a contractor pour a second reinforced pad beside it, plenty of room for both. Dale came by last week. He had a look at the tread assembly, tightened something with a wrench, and said she's good for another 30 years. I told him I doubted I'd need 30 years. He said with a grin that caught the light, "You'd be surprised." Down the street, someone had posted a new notice on the community board. I didn't read it yet, but I would.